Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NSCA Weightlifting SIG interview series. I am pleased to have Shaun Joffe from the United Kingdom joining me today. Shaun and I, we've only spoken once before, but we have a large amount of common interest, both from a research academic standpoint as well as a interest in coaching and sport. And I think that we probably, because of that, share similar motivations and interests in terms of sort of why we got into doing the work that we do. I'm going to let Shaun introduce his his journey and talk about how he got into sport, how he got into weightlifting, and here and there I'll sort of jump in during his self-introduction, mentioning a couple places he's been and places he's worked.
Okay. Yeah, thanks first of all for having me, guys. Really good to try and engage with other people in a fairly similar area, both obviously within the UK and across the pond there. I think both countries are in fairly similar positions when it comes to weightlifting and their kind of rise to improving their performance standards over the last few years, which has, been a testament to, to some extent, the high quality work that's been going in from an academic standpoint, as well as the improvement in coaching. And I think that's, I think it's reflective of both sides. So, so I guess just to provide a bit of a background really on myself, I really came to this through the strength and conditioning route. After finishing my undergraduate degree, I did the master's degree at Edinburgh University, which I think was set up by Dr. Stone well back. So I did that in around 2008, 2009. Prior to that, I kind of had some background in a bit of gym-based training, and most of my sports were nothing strength related. It was weightlifting. Sorry, it wasn't weightlifting. It was things like basketball, football, and things like that. But I hadn't really gotten anywhere near the sport of weightlifting. I knew of it, but hadn't had much experience with it. So it was only really after doing that I kind of got introduced to the concept of Olympic weightlifting and where it might be utilized in strength and conditioning to improve athletic performance. And obviously Mike Stone being a big advocate of the use of the Olympic lifts in strength and conditioning, the degree program definitely had like an orientation towards that, and it was very much supported the use of the Olympic lifts and encouraged many of the students that were on that program to make use of those lifts and learn them to a high standard so that they could be effectively teach them. So I essentially probably got first introduced to it through some of the academics that were on the program from like a theoretical perspective, but they utilized some strength and conditioning coaches from like the Scottish Institute of Sport to come in and help teach us, and that were people like Neil Potts and Neil Crosby, and they kind of helped teach many of the students the Olympic lifts, and that was kind of just my first introduction to it. Did my MSc, kind of had a bit of a taste for the sport, and had realized that my hometown in Woking was home to a very reputable club, Olympic Weightlifting Club. It was run by a guy named Brian Hamill. People might know Brian based on his paper, which was published in JSCR probably back in 1992, 93. I think it was like one of the first epidemiological studies on like injury prevalence in strength sports, and showed it to be a very safe and effective method of safe and effective sport compared to other UK like school-based sports such as football and rugby and things like that. And obviously it's still heavily cited today as a way of kind of justifying the suitability of weightlifting and weight training in that population. So when I got back and finished my master's, I went and joined the club as a chance just to kind of learn the movements, and that kind of got me into competing, and spent a few years just enjoying being in that environment, competing. Got to let's say a reasonable standard, nothing to write home about, but fell in love with the sport and really enjoyed it, and which is where I'm coaching today, but I'll come on to that in just a minute. I spent a lot of time kind of volunteering around in strength and conditioning, different strength and conditioning sort of internships. So I did one when I was in Edinburgh with Edinburgh Rugby with Neil Potts through the SRU. Later on, I did another one when I went back home with like another rugby club, and then eventually did an internship with the English Institute of Sport with GB and England Hockey, and that
was around 06, 07?
No. So this would have been around 2010 when I first got in, and then as an internship basis, and then kind of got my first position there as an entry level strength and conditioning coach. So that was about 2011. So that was just prior to the London Olympic Games. So that was with, I guess I kind of had one main mentor, which was Dave Hamilton, and then another guy who I would work quite closely with, who headed up the other program. I guess you'd say was in a similar mentor capacity. Was a guy called Andy Hudson. So those were the two guys that headed up the programs. And then, that was a great kind of intro to strength and conditioning, because that team went on to win a bronze medal at the Olympic Games. And then shortly after, I found myself as the lead strength and conditioning coach for the Paralympic rowing team for Great Britain, still through the English Institute of Sport. Spent about 2.5, maybe 3 years around that time working with that. So that was very new, hadn't really worked in disability sport and had to learn a whole new set of skills. Meanwhile, still kind of competing and running weightlifting courses and things like that. And then around 2014, actually, for the sake of context, British weightlifting had lost their funding after the 2012 Olympic Games. So they had a pot of money, which was there to run a performance program off the back of London. Because they hadn't necessarily met their performance standard targets, they were stripped of that funding, but then were fortunately able to regain some funding specifically for the women's program in 2014. And it was shortly after then that they advertised for a position in kind of like a strength and conditioning science, performance science capacity to work across both the Olympic and Paralympic programs. So kind of dropped everything, including relationships, home, everything like that, just to move up to Loughborough. If I was successful, I interviewed for it and they offered me the position. So jumped at the chance because, working with weightlifting was probably like the goal by that point. I've experienced a lot of other sports, but there was something about the rawness of just such a simple strength power sport that was very attractive. I think team sports, I don't know, maybe it's just my way of thinking, there's too many variables to control. I really like the nature of like real strength power sports. So took the opportunity, moved up to Loughborough, which is where the national program was based, and then spent 3 years, about 3 years, maybe slightly longer, working with that program, and that was up until the Rio cycle, and that was specifically with the women's program. Again, unfortunately, went through the same thing. Off the back of Rio, didn't hit the performance standards again. And then we found ourselves in a position without funding. So I moved very temporarily kind of across to the national governing body, working with them just to help like course material and things like that, and realized, I'd moved myself around too much a lot, and I think I was kind of ready to get back home, find maybe a new avenue to focus on. Hence, I ended up at St. Mary's in a slightly different career, working in academia. But it was sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, could you talk some about what those 3 years involved with your role with GB Weightlifting?
Yeah, so like when I first started, it was quite a unique situation in that like every athlete that was on the program had their own like personal coach. Obviously, some coaches had multiple athletes that were there in the program, but for the sake of how the program was run, there was never an intention for the national coach or the national centre coach to take control over those athletes. Kind of the program respected that athletes had their personal coaches, and that we were there really as a kind of a support mechanism to try and help in whichever ways we could through kind of sports science and medicine services to try and help improve I guess the support structure around those athletes and help realize their potential, really. So obviously within the support structure, we had a sports psychologist, a physiotherapist, and a strength and conditioning scientist, performance scientist, which was myself. And that was across the Olympic and the Paralympic programme. And so, really my role there was, I guess it was a bit of a blank canvas when I started. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to pan out. I had some ideas when I first started, and I think, weightlifting is not necessarily the most, wasn't necessarily the most open sport to sports science, let's say interventions. Let's say it's quite a traditional sport, quite a cultural, kind of a culturally influenced sport. Has kind of some of its own ways of doing things, which sometimes we try to say change. Sometimes you need to respect the culture that already exists there. And so I kind of had a bit of a challenge of trying to think, how do we actually build in like a strength and conditioning or performance science service around these athletes to try and help them realize their potential. And there are a number of things that we try to do, and some I'd say were far more successful than others. And I think it became a point of almost tailoring what was most appropriate for any athlete. So a bog standard package that we would just roll out to every athlete. We were really trying to essentially sort of fill the gaps that may have been the most limiting to each individual. So if some may be more prevalent, had a high incidence rate of injury, and they kept, let's say, getting a back injury, we'd try and maybe put things around that to resolve that particular issue. If some athletes were far more into that, their program being informed and influenced and driven by the use of data, then we'd try and fill that. So it's very difficult to put my hat on one particular thing that we did. I think it was the strategy was very much about providing like a bespoke package around each individual according to what them and their coaches needed for their training. Unfortunately, there were some things we were able to do. So one of the things that we were able to, sell to the athlete and justify and get them to buy into was the use of frequent performance testing, evaluating neuromuscular characteristics. And I'm sure we'll get onto this, but this is kind of where some of the research that I've been involved with recently has come about from some of those ideas and concepts that we discussed earlier on, and some of the data that we're able to capture on those athletes.
How many athletes, how many coaches? Because I could see, maybe several weightlifters would be coached by the same coach. And even just sort of the geographical situation, like when it came to performance testing, was it the athletes and the coaches coming to Loughborough, or were you having to do some traveling, bringing devices with you?
Yeah, so we were based at Loughborough University. So they got an amazing setup there, brilliant facility, and being through the English Institute of Sport, obviously we had all the facilities and equipment that come with the national governing body investing in that sports science and medicine service. So we kind of had an evolving strategy. So some athletes largely did most of their training in their home gyms and would travel up probably as and when they felt was needed to engage with the physiotherapist, myself, and the sports psych, or the program director, or performance director. And some athletes actually moved themselves to Loughborough so they could make use of that service full time. So it was slightly different, which is what I mean by, the package was slightly different according to each individual athlete. For the most part, I can't recall, I don't think we ever really took anything away. Like more often than not, the athletes would come to Loughborough, and then we would make sure that once we knew that they were going to be there for 2 days, then we would put a schedule together for that 2 days and know exactly when we were going to capture any data, when they might have arranged times with the nutritionist, physiotherapist, sports psych, and then I'd have my time slot, which I would have to capture capture that data on the athletes. So, which is why we ended up in a position where some athletes I had maybe 3 or 4 data points per year, and others have had about 30 data points per year, just because we were interested in seeing, what truly might have been the fluctuations in some of these characteristics over a long period of time. So yeah, that's kind of how it tended to work. I mean, does that kind of answer the question?
It does. And then, it's interesting because now we see all these different examples of sort of the high performance model within professional sport, collegiate sport, various club systems, but it is, I think, somewhat unique for weightlifting, and probably what does go on, we see much less of, I would say, compared to like professional sport, really housed within NGBs and sort of the national structure of the sport. So moving from there, talk some about what you're doing now at St. Mary's, and then we'll jump into talking some about your research, which is, I think a lot of it started during your time with GB Weightlifting.
Yeah, so now I'm a lecturer in strength and conditioning at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London. I've been there for about 3 years now. It took me a while to kind of get into the research side of things, kind of settling into, I guess, a whole new, career. Still in the same discipline, but teaching it rather than delivering. So yeah, it was an interesting transition, first of all, because I think first of all you get a perspective from both ends, and you can see perhaps the frustrations of practitioners on academics, and vice versa, the frustration of academics on practitioners. And yeah, I think I've got a better appreciation for both disciplines, and I think that this is perhaps just a generally more wider discussion point, but yeah, I think a bit being that a little bit more appreciative as to what it takes to do research, and it's far more complicated than perhaps some practitioners may think. But then equally, academics can often perhaps miss the point, and I think need to still remain focused on, particularly when we're thinking about things that are actually going to impact on performance. Really asking meaningful questions that are actually going to, make a real meaningful or tangible change to what we do practically. So I feel quite fortunate to have been in that position to get a sense of both sides of things. And I guess people say it's a humbling experience, because it perhaps some of the assumptions I've made on academics being really far removed from practice and not necessarily understanding it. Actually, I actually understand why they are as sometimes what might appear rigid or not necessarily off the point, but having a better understanding as to how they approach what they do. So that's kind of where I've been for the last 3 years. So in about 2 years ago, I got talking to one of my colleagues, Jamie Talent, who's now kind of, I guess you'd say, is working as my kind of PhD supervisor, although I'm not technically enrolled in a PhD because I'm intending to do it through this PhD by publication route. But just discussing, I went to him. He's well published and also been in practice. So a great person to speak to, because I could see hopefully some similarities about where I would hope my career to focus towards, and got talking about some of the questions that arose out of my time of working with British weightlifting, and then how we might be able to look at writing up some of these ideas. And I had quite a large data set which I'd captured from the program, and with the permissions of the NGB to actually utilize that data, we actually have started writing some of it up. So the first article was published about just more than a year ago, and that was looking at some of the neuromuscular predictors of weightlifting competition performance, and looking at 2 of those probably more frequently examined assessments, so the isometric mid-thigh pull and the counter movement jump. And the research question for that paper really came about from, I guess, a discussion that I had with Jamie about what were some of the patterns that were emerging from the data. Excuse me. And one of the distinguishing factors was that, well, it seemed to be the case that the isometric mid-thigh pull and the counter movement jump both strongly predict weightlifting performance. And this is data that actually presented at the UKSCA conference, I think just shortly after the Olympics, showing very strong correlations between the two. But it was only after kind of when you actually plot the data and look at it, how it's changing over time, which is what you're largely looking for as a practitioner, are these characteristics changing. And it was only really the strength characteristics that were changing over the time course, over the 3 years of data that were collected. And counter movement jump power output wasn't necessarily, or any of the counter movement jump variables weren't really changing with performance. And so we kind of spoke to him about that, and we said, yeah, this is interesting. Maybe we can look at, is the data in such a way that it could be, written up in make sure there's enough data there over long enough periods of time to actually answer the question. And fortunately there was. And then we ran the study and did it as a linear multiple regression analysis. And there's basically two ways in which we looked at the results. So first of all, cross-sectionally, how well isometric mid-thigh pull and counter movement jump variables predicted weightlifting performance. And for those who've read the paper, I'm sure you know there's a very strong prediction of weightlifting performance. Between about 90 to 95% of the variance explained by isometric mid-thigh pull peak force and counter movement jump peak power, which again probably shouldn't be a completely novel or unexpected finding to anyone who knows the weightlifting literature. But one of the things that we wanted to do is also show not cross-sectionally, but longitudinally, what were the changes associated with the change in those variables over time and how well those were associated with the changes in competition performance. And interestingly, once you run the analysis that way, what happens is the counter movement jump variables, all of the variables are eliminated from the model, suggesting that only the changes in maximal strength characteristics in the isometric mid-thigh pull are determining the changes in weightlifting performance. That's not necessarily to say that it's just strength, but we need to be mindful of the fact that counter movement jump is one point across that force velocity curve or load velocity curve. So it's representative of kind of a lighter load ballistic power movement rather than a heavy loaded ballistic power movement. So arguably, there's something to be said there for what physical qualities we might actually try and develop or emphasize our training towards, or if we're looking to focus weightlifting training towards specific neuromuscular qualities, but then also how we might actually interpret those tests. So one of the conclusions that we came to and suggestions that we made was that the isometric mid-thigh pull is a test that you would potentially monitor long-term as something that would theoretically change with weightlifting performance, but the counter movement jump, because it still discriminates between levels of performance, arguably might be more favorably used as a talent identification tool. So there's two potential really valuable applications from that study, and then that's kind of really where we've got to with that study. The intention is to follow this up with some training interventions, but we've just unfortunately gone through a long pandemic which has stopped us from doing anything intervention based. But there's some real novelty there, because it's confirming much of what's already been discussed in that literature, but now looking at it longitudinally, are we seeing the associated changes as we'd expect? And surprisingly, only one of the variables that we've commonly referred to as predictors of weightlifting performance were the only thing that actually changed with weightlifting performance over time.
Yeah, that's great. And to brag on that paper a little bit, I think the level of those weightlifters, international level, and the duration over time, I know it was several years. How many years was it?
It was 2 years. So we basically, because like I said, this is the challenge with trying to publish retrospective data. is like, if this is the time course of the year, we've got one athlete who's, so I'll put my hands back in where you can see them. We'd have some athletes who would have like really, really consistent like isometric pull data, and then we'll have one that had one here, like maybe one a quarter, maybe a little bit more frequently than that. So it's like, well, how are we going to try and represent these guys in the same way? So we just said like, the most consistent way we're going to be able to do this is to average 1 year and average the next year, both across performance variables and isometric and counter movement jump variables. And, fully acknowledge there's going to be limitations within that, but certainly it was enough to be able to standardize the group that we did have and the data that we did have, and then it gave us some very interesting findings.
There's some relevant aspects to that you hit on a moment ago, talking about the sort of the applied scientist and the academic, where I joke that athlete monitoring, which is one of my favorite ways of doing sports science, it is that retrospective approach where we have this athlete monitoring program. We're bringing in athletes to test, often based on their availability. When the coach is okay with bringing them in, we deal with NCAA accountable hours at the collegiate level, and we have to be mindful of what the coach is willing to give us. And sort of doing this athlete monitoring, and retrospectively go back and look at it, and try to make heads or tails and get some research from that. One of the things that really stood out about that paper to me was the sort of athlete monitoring got really popular in many levels of sports. That's a lot. And I think that there's sort of we can split long-term adaptation development approach to where basically our athlete developing is our program work. And we have the day-to-day monitoring and the sort of fatigue management side of things. And I think that force from an iso pull or maximal strength is often ignored in this monitoring view of things, because it's not, it's a pretty stable adaptation. It's not a good indicator. That part to it. And there's also, those athletes over 2 years are really strong to begin with. They've been training for a really, really long time in the weight room. Some of them, I would imagine, they've probably been high-level weightlifters, for example, junior lifters.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to, slowly over time, improve their...
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what's, I guess, probably one of the more simplistic outcomes from this. It's telling us that this adaptation of getting stronger in a strength sport is, it's a fundamental objective. And sometimes you think, when I was writing it, is this so simple that anyone who actually reads it is just going to think, what you're expecting this to be like something new? Like, of course you need to get stronger, but I think we touched on this last time we spoke, is that there's often a discussion, not just in weightlifting, but across a number of sports, that I guess that continuum of technique or skill and strength, and where do you prioritize your training, and how much of that training there is an overlap in the middle of as well. And certainly in weightlifting, much of the technical training is still strength training. But then how much can you really rely on snatches and clean and jerks to improve snatch and clean and jerk, and how much potentially do we need to rely on raising our maximal force capacity through things like squats and pulls in order to increase that capacity to translate into an improvement in performance? And I mean, I don't necessarily know if I have an answer. I think I have some ideas. Much of my philosophy around the way in which our program now with my weightlifters is very much a case of, I guess you would say, probably is like a block periodization model, but I wouldn't say it's as strictly defined as that. But I really do try and emphasize blocks of maximal strength, not just getting legs stronger, but positional strength, overhead strength, ability to hold the position at the knee, all of those things. I think just raising that capacity and then transitioning it into the lifts, and trying not to solely rely on snatch and clean and jerk as being the driving factors for improvement in performance, which is, I don't think is what many weightlifting coaches do. But I think it's like, what's nice about this running concurrently with me being a weightlifting coach as well, it kind of reinforces or even challenges my philosophy about how I approach programming. And this was perhaps one of these things. And, I think one of the questions that paper also does question, or certainly got me to question myself, is where does, lighter loaded ballistic training come into weightlifting if we're expecting to see highly specific adaptations with respect to like the force velocity curve, and would expect perhaps more velocity based adaptations by doing high speed ballistic training, which is what we're assessing when we're assessing a counter movement jump. How much am I realistically expecting that to transition over into improvement in weightlifting performance? And we still see lots of people advocate for the use of plyometrics, and I certainly wouldn't, or not ballistics and plyometrics, and I wouldn't say I'm opposed to its use in Olympic weightlifting, but I still don't necessarily even have a strong standpoint about where that's actually going to come into my program. And I honestly, I don't really program it that often. Like maybe if someone can't snatch or clean and jerk just due to a wrist injury, I'll have them do squat jumps. But it's another question that I think needs addressing, because I think we sometimes brand explosive training as this one umbrella, and like perhaps not considerate of the specificity, specifically when it comes to the load that we're trying to express, like high force and high velocity in the conditions under.
Are you still working with data from your time with GB Weightlifting, or have you more transitioned to research with your current club at St. Mary's?
So I think it'd be kind of like beating a dead horse now. I think that data set has probably been split up in as many ways as possible to maybe try and look at it. There was one thing that potentially was, but I'm not sure if I've got enough individuals to actually run this analysis on. And this is the problem with doing it this way. You're starting with a conclusion, which is not where necessarily how we should be doing research. And this is perhaps one of the limitations when it does come to things using retrospective data, is because I've been looking at it for such a long time. I feel like my mind's already made up, so it's not necessarily the best way to approach it. But so we ran like a talent identification program and working with British weightlifting. And what was very interesting, and this is perhaps where Olympic weightlifting can be justified still with its use in transitioning to improving lower body power output, is that the power improvements that we saw in everyone that I went through the talent ID process and then put on for an intensive block of training, like 8 to 12 weeks, we saw ridiculously high rates of improvements in lower body power output. Like counter movement jump power output increasing by like 15-20% over like 12 weeks. But that was doing like a 4 or 5 sessions a week Olympic weightlifting program, with the intention of at the end of that 12 weeks potentially getting onto the program. So these athletes were really hitting the ground hard with this block of training, and like really, the rate of adaptation that we saw in that first block was very, very rapid in terms of lower body power output in the counter movement jump. But what's interesting when looking at that trajectory, it's almost very, very consistent, and it almost just sits almost stagnant for most of the athletes, whilst for the remainder of their time on that program. I got 3 years of data of some athletes whose counter movement jump power output is just a flat line for 3 years. If anything, maybe an indication of it dropping off slightly whilst their performance is still improving. But we've got so few athletes within that, it probably wouldn't be enough to run a study on. But it's something, being in the privileged position to actually look at that data set and try and pull it apart and come up with some of these hypotheses that might actually lead to future research. So the second study that I've published was also on that previous data set. But going forwards, I think, I probably need to start collecting some new data. And like you said, I've got a club full of weightlifters who are eager to be participants.
Yep. We'll talk about your situation at St. Mary's and your club in a second. But could you talk a little bit about the study you referred to there? So you said you recently had a paper accepted, and so that was that data from the
so that was from the same cohort. No, it wasn't the same cohort. This was a slightly larger group. I'd have to look back and figure out how we were distinguishing between the two, but slightly larger group, and included competitive male weightlifters that were on either the development program or the kind of senior. I wouldn't even call it a program. They weren't a funded group at the time, but they were the senior male weightlifters at the time that were still supported by the NGB. So we still were able to capture some data on them. They just weren't necessarily the funded athletes. Anyway, so basically, when I first got there, one of the discussions that we had with what would have been the head coach at the time, which was a guy called Giles Greenwood. Giles was a very accomplished weightlifter back in his day. Won a Commonwealth Games bronze medal. I think he's like in a super heavyweight class, like snatch 180, clean and jerking over 200 kilos. So it's him, and then our performance director Tommy Yule, who was also a competitive weightlifter. I think his brother might have been coached by Mike Stone at one time as well. So
I recognize the name.
Yeah. So like speaking to those guys, obviously they know the sport very well, being very accomplished athletes in the sport. We kind of sat down and talked about, what is the testing battery going to look like? What needs to be included? And one of the things that we discussed was the use of not just the isometric mid-thigh pull, but the isometric pull from the start position from the floor. And the idea behind that was just to essentially match up the force, try to get a measure of maximal force capacity at each of the key positions throughout the lift. So we did one at the floor at the end of the first pull, so bar position at about the knee, and then in the start of the second pull, so isometric mid-thigh pull. So we had three key positions that we looked at when it came to testing. The new study is essentially just looking at the relationship between the isometric pull from the start position and the isometric mid-thigh pull with weightlifting performance. We didn't use the position at the knee, and just after collecting that data for about a year, the reliability statistics were so bad. I think it's because when you put someone in an isometric pull position from the knee, some people try and transition and push their knees under the bar. Some people almost try to continue that last maybe few centimeters of the first pull, so trying to still stay over. So you had some people who were trying to come upright, some people were still trying to stay over and push. So we just got very, very inconsistent results. As much as we tried to cue it, this might be more reflective on my standardization of the test, but we tried a few things. It wasn't the best, but the isometric pull from the floor was great. In fact, actually, in our case, actually had better reliability statistics than the isometric mid-thigh pull, which is arguably one of the benefits to this, and you can see it quite nicely. It's represented in this paper. So essentially we just ran similar analysis, just looking at the correlations between these two positions with weightlifting performance. And what we did is run it both where all the variables were absolute or then allometrically scaled, and we didn't necessarily mix the two. So we didn't look at an allometrically scaled variable with an absolute performance variable. So it was all allometrically scaled or all absolute. And as you'd expect, isometric mid-thigh pull, very strong correlation with weightlifting performance. Similarly, we saw that same with the isometric pull from the start position. And then one of the things we included in the analysis was actually running a correlation analysis running an analysis as to which correlation was if this correlation was significantly greater than the other. So when we look at it in absolute terms, there isn't an indication that either is a stronger predictor than the other. But when we actually allometrically scale it and remove the influence of body mass, what we tend to see is that Isometric pull from the start position has a significantly greater correlation with weightlifting performance than the isometric mid-thigh pull, and that was for the snatch, and that was for the trying to get this right now. I've just read this the other day. So I'm going to summarize this so I don't get it wrong. It was two, certainly in the snatch and the total, the isometric pull from the start position showed greater correlations, or significantly greater correlation with weightlifting performance than the isometric pull from the start position. So there's an indication there that that test actually may be a better predictor of weightlifting performance, and just that variable alone had R values, I think, of between 0.90 and 0.95, something in that region. So very strong predictors. When you break it down based on male and female, the females had a slightly lower correlation with weightlifting performance than in males. We only tended to see that significantly greater correlation when we combined the groups, so it wasn't there with male and female. So it's important to acknowledge that. So there's an indication that the isometric pull from the start position may be a better predictor of weightlifting performance than the isometric mid-thigh pull. There's actually one. Sorry, mate.
I'm sorry. I was going to say something I thought about after we chatted last week was for the ISO pull from the floor. It's much easier to set up than the mid-thigh, in that we know how high the bar is off of the floor, and it's like that for everybody versus individualized setup.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue there's a limitation in that as well, because you're going to get like subtle differences based on anthropometry and mobility. The isometric mid-thigh pull generally looks the same for most people, whereas the isometric pull from the start position will look quite different depending on how people tend to start.
Would you tell them start like you're going to perform a clean?
Yeah, so this is where we kind of this was probably where we hit a bit of a sticking point when we were first doing this. Like, how do you cue it? So we still kept the pull as hard and as fast as you can from the floor. Naturally, what we tended to see that it took a little bit longer to attain peak force. This is without necessarily running any big statistics on it. Like, visually, it seemed to take slightly longer to attain that peak force value. But like, knowingly, I think the athletes, we didn't look at rate of force development characteristics in this study anyway. But for the athletes, most of them but watching it looks like they're trying to lift a weight from the floor rather than jerk into the movement. So whether they truly perform that movement in that manner was questionable. 100% I'm confident that the peak force value that we obtained was a representation of their maximal force capacity. If we were to obtain some rate of force development values from that, it'd be interesting to see what the reliability on that would have been. But essentially, we mainly looked at the peak force characteristics from that position anyway.
And so you just had to mimic their position.
Yeah, as long as it hit like our kind of our normal descriptive criteria that we work off for the first pull. So, for example, the shoulders being in advance of the bar, the hips being higher than the knees, shoulders being higher than the hips, arms remain straight, like feet remaining flat, bar position over kind of the joint at the big toe. Like, that's the kind of, we just needed to make sure that was in place, and then we just performed the test with the intention of mainly just obtaining a peak force value. So they were encouraged to try and move it as explosively as possible. If we were to continue on with that, I think maybe it needs a revisit whether cueing it in the same way as you would with the isometric mid-thigh pull is appropriate, because it's a different movement as to how you would intend to perform the second pull. But like I said, we're very confident in the peak force values, and the reliability statistics on the peak force were very good. One of the very interesting findings from this, though, is that particularly when these this data was allometrically scaled, the isometric pull from the start position actually had a very weak, or actually no correlation with the isometric mid-thigh pull. So that, for me, really that suggests, doesn't necessarily confirm it, suggests that those two qualities, even though they are maximal force capacity, evaluating maximal force capacity of the hip, knee and ankle, or the triple extensors, exactly the same musculature. What's only different really is the positional setup. That the fact that there's no significant correlation between the two, and nothing that even indicates that there may have been, if the sample size was bigger, it was very, very low R value. That indicates that these may be reflective of independent neuromuscular qualities, and if they are independent, perhaps there may be some rationale there to be training those regions of the pull slightly differently. And if you look at a lot of the research that looks at, a lot of it's being done in isometric training, and there's to take that with a pinch of salt as well. But the findings are very consistent when you train at a longer muscle length, so theoretically close to what would be the start position of the first pull. You get a much more systemic improvement in strength across the entire muscle length, versus if you train at kind of a shorter muscle length, so just let's say doing second pulls, so pulls from mid-thigh, from blocks, you get a much larger magnitude in improvement, but the effects are less systemic across the muscle length. And that directly then relates to me, well, certainly directly for me, it starts to make me think about like the use of derivatives, and where are the use of derivatives applicable, not just in the transfer to sports performance, which is largely where a lot of the literature is actually being focused on right now. From a weightlifting perspective, there's so many more derivatives below, the start of the transition phase, like involving the first pull, that we could potentially be taking advantage of. And I think to some extent, the work that, that people like Tim Suckermel are doing is great. And it's really giving us some great insight to the use of derivatives around that second pull. But I think there's much more from a weightlifting perspective to be done, looking at the use of derivatives at the start of the movement. And I think, mechanically, it kind of makes sense. The weakest position of a dynamic movement should be that's the theoretical limit to what you can lift. And if you see, it hasn't necessarily been consolidated or pulled into a single study, but you'll see it in some other studies that have done something similarly, like in the back squat, bench press, or the deadlift. But all of those studies consistently show that the isometric testing position closer to or at the start, or is equivalent to the start of the concentric phase of the movement, despite being a weaker position, actually produces a greater correlation with that dynamic movement. So isometric bench press on the chest actually has a greater correlation with bench press than isometric bench press. So you can't even see my hands, kind of like maybe halfway through the concentric movement. And then the same thing's been seen in the deadlift, same thing's been seen in the back squat. And that, if you put it in simple terms, the weakest position is going to determine how much load you can separate from the floor or you can push off your chest. So it brings into question for me also maybe the justification of isometric testing setup being around that peak of the strength curve. Now, I know, like, if you look at Greg Haff's study from 1997, it wasn't necessarily just that it was the peak of the strength curve. It was very specific to the second pull, producing the highest forces and velocities and rate of force development in the lift, which, that makes perfect sense. But I think there's something to be said for looking at actually, well, what's the capacity in the weakest position? Because that's going to limit how much force you can how much load you can separate from the floor. So whether it's transferable to the Olympic lifts, this is the first study really that's looked at it, and so far it suggests that same phenomena kind of holds up. We should potentially be looking at the maximal force capacity in the start position. And just, I guess, one point, and I'll let you jump in. I think that, like I said, this relates then to how you would train the movement. So off the back of that, I think one of the things that I've thought about is that I've actually, I've trialed a number of blocks of training where I've, rather than pulls, I've been supplementing training flow programs with snatch deadlifts or clean deadlifts, because we're just trying to train a maximal capacity to just lift that weight rather than pulls being having a greater emphasis on like that second pull. That's where we're trying to really speed up. And so far, like many of the athletes are saying, they feel much better in being able to hold their position. They feel having their ability to separate the bar. They've got much more, I don't know, connection is the term that people often kind of talk about. They feel much more connected to the bar. They can really feel like they're driving the bar through the first pull and accelerating the bar during the first pull. And from a weightlifting coach's perspective, it's so important to the movement. Like, I know we shouldn't necessarily be yanking the bar from the floor, but it's so important to actually generate some acceleration during the first pull. We can't just rely on the second pull to project the bar. We need to actually gain some velocity throughout the entire lift.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I can't help but think of is one of Mike Stone's sort of classic talks on power development. He refers to weightlifting as a combination exercise, strength and power. And on the floor during the transition, critical strength development can come from that. Lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about the current situation with Woking Weightlifting while you're at St. Mary's. I wanted to say, you said that you inherited the club, that the club was already existing. And then just, talk a little bit about being not just the head weightlifting coach for the club, but then also that sort of coordinator, management side of
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting journey to have gone through, because I went from working as a strength and conditioning practitioner in the English Institute of Sport, got into what I thought was the pinnacle. Weightlifting is a sport I wanted to work with, national program, brilliant, like in a sports science role. And I felt like everything I had at my disposal was going to be there, and it wasn't necessarily the case. It was much more challenging than I thought it was going to be. You don't just get to decide what the athletes do. They've got a head coach, which means you have to interact with their head coach, and you've got to not persuade them. Persuasion is probably the wrong word. You've got to create a good enough argument that what you're going to do is actually going to have a positive impact with the athlete. So, I think that was an interesting way of working. And as much as I really enjoyed it and learned so much about the sport, it became a bit frustrating. So I was like, I actually just want to coach. I don't want necessarily to have to go through or be a middleman, or have to try and go through somebody else to try and improve this athlete's performance. And quite rightly so. This guy's been working with someone for 10 years. I've been here for 10 minutes, and now I'm telling him that he needs to do isometric testing from the start of the second pull or the power position. And they said, well, the power position doesn't exist and all this stuff. And they've got a complete own philosophy, and they're producing European and Commonwealth medalists. So I'm like, fair enough. You don't have to listen to me. But I got to a point I was like, I enjoy the sport, but I want to do it myself. So while I was actually in Loughborough, before I came down to Woking, I actually set up Loughborough's weightlifting club with a couple of students. And it's gone from strength to strength. And even now it's in great hands, and really pleased to have seen it, move in such a way. I moved back to kind of the southeast of England, and to Woking, which is kind of where I grew up, and realized, like I said earlier on, that Woking Weightlifting Club was there, competed there for some time. And then after moving around and everything, when I went back down to train, my old coach, Brian, he was still coaching into his 80s. He absolutely loved the sport, and, with huge respect to Brian, he's done so much for the sport in the UK. He's one of these people that was just so heavily invested, took very little out of it, just gave everything. And I certainly say so much of where weightlifting in the UK is because of the work of Brian and people like Brian. Brian's health was deteriorating. Unfortunately, he passed away a few months ago, which was very sad for everyone. All the comments and messages that the club received off the back of it really kind of goes to show how much of an impact he did have on weightlifting in the UK. But He wasn't doing too bad when I first moved back down, but he was very much keen to be able to step back, and I think he was considering even closing the club, just because, and maybe just disseminating all the equipment out to other clubs in the area. But I just saw it there as an opportunity just to, take the reins and I guess call it a project really. I get to run my own weightlifting club, and fortunately to be in a position where I've full-time working in academia, and I don't have to rely on weightlifting as my source of income. It's purely as an interest and a hobby and a passion. So if I get busy at work, like I can just step back and just do the minimum I need. I need to coach, turn up, and that's it. I don't have to invest lots of time into all the other administrative things all year round. So anyway, I took over that. Like it wasn't in the best state. There wasn't many people competing, but slowly but surely we've managed to create like a really good training environment, and we've got some very good competitive lifters there now. But yeah, it was very much a different way of working, going from a national program to I've kind of gone from the elite squad to grassroots in a matter of months, and it was completely different. And I think it made me very quickly reevaluate what I think is important when it comes to weightlifting. So I think we had the conversation last time, like, as much as I'd like to monitor things like volume loads, like that's the first thing that went out the window. It was just simply, right, maybe put 4 key programs that I can recycle, that I know are good enough and broad enough that they're going to make progress. They're not individualized, but it means I've got something to hand that somebody new comes in who's got a little bit of experience, like here's a program, you can follow this for 4 weeks, and as long as I'm there, I can tweak and change and make decisions on the day. So that was something that was very much an eye-opening experience, like coming from a sports science practitioner role, and all the sports science practitioner things that you want to do, the fancy science stuff, probably gets put on the back burner while you're just getting things set up.
I'm sure, Shaun, if you ever go back to working with the elite weightlifters and their coaches, the perspective you'll now have from the grassroots experience will probably in some way, many ways even, influence how you think through working with them, the communication, how you might.
100%. Yeah, like it's, I guess, I would say we went into that role slightly naive, but I think there was no other way of, being less naive than just spending time in the sport and just doing it. So yeah, I completely agree that I certainly have a much better perspective of all the things that used to frustrate me with other coaches, like either, not replying to my email when I messaged them about a report I sent them about a counter movement jump. Like I completely get why they've got so many other things on their plate. So that's, it's an interesting and humbling experience, because it does take a lot of time, and you're not just dealing with, writing programs and coaching athletes. There's so much more to it involved, managing like the membership, making sure people are paying their fees. A plate is broken and we need to replace a bit of kit that's not going to arrive for 6 weeks. So what do you do for, in the meantime, if something's broken or out of action? Like there's so many other things that need to be taken into consideration. I think we're finally at a point now, like, fortunately the club, but the standard of the club and the reputation of the club has grown quite considerably over the last 3 years. And as frustrating as it has been, sometimes I just want it to be there at the finish point. But I think over time you start to realize there is no finish point, and it's just a continuous cycle of trying to make things a little bit better. And fair enough, if I look at yesterday, it's not much different. But if I look at it 6 months, 9 months, 12 months behind, we've actually come on quite substantially. In the 3 years that I've been there, we've got like 2 national squad members. They haven't competed internationally yet, but we've got one who's now within kind of the England squad, who is eligible for selection for the Commonwealth Games, which is great. It's making a huge progress. Really committed athlete. It's like exactly the type of athlete that you want to walk through your door. Kind of, they put put the onus on you to bring you up to their standard rather than you trying to bring them with you, which is really good. Another youth lifter who's been absolutely brilliant, like really, really committed. Like she's one of the first athletes to have sorted out all of her equipment and her home training during lockdown. And she's like 15 years old, like absolutely spot on. It's exactly the things that you want out of it. And there's no, that's exactly the reason why these two are, you know, some of the better lifters at the club. And then we've also just got lots of national competitors. And in that time, we've produced a number of national champions of different age groups. So British and English. So we have two national championships, an English championships and a British championships, and in different age categories. So the youth and juniors. And then we also had a masters lifter who won the European silver medal last year, which was great. So when I look at that and I say it out loud, I'm like, yeah, we've actually done a really great job in a fairly short period of time. But like one of the things that I have to say is, this is perhaps something that I'm sure you'd agree with. And I think, again, we probably talked about this last time. One of the things I've learned the most about weightlifting is that probably the biggest attribute that a coach can have is probably patience, because it is a long-term sport. If someone is going to go from, you know, if they get into the sport in their youth, it's probably going to take them 10 years to get to the standard that you can, you know, to the best standard that they can achieve. 10 years is a long time to invest into something. And although we've seen a big improvement in a short period of time, like you just have to be patient. You have to just take training session by training session and actually enjoy every single training session. And I think that's one of the big differences. Like, as a practitioner, you try and maybe overcomplicate, I don't know, make up a word here, like scienceify like the process and make it too medicalized. And like people just in weightlifting just really enjoy training. And I think that's an important thing, that one of the reasons why people do prefer club environments over, you know, performance center environments, because it feels a bit more natural. It feels a bit more of that camaraderie between their like their fellow members. And I think like that's one of the things I'll probably spend, you know, what would sometimes be reading around different training methods and training theories of like, actually, you know what, maybe I just need to think about 5 more songs I add to the Spotify playlist, because, you know, it's trying to get people keen and excited to actually want to be there and enjoy it. And those are the things that I've started to notice make the difference. And, you know, and I don't want to contradict myself, you know, I'm an academic and I'm studying the science, you know, really the determinants of weightlifting performance to better inform what we do in terms of training. But I think, you know, there's a big element that we sometimes miss when we're trying to be very objective and scientific, that the reason why so many weightlifting clubs are successful, and I'm mainly talking about the UK here, is not because they've got, you know, sports scientists or, you know, coaches who have written very extensive articles around this, but they just create incredible training environments. And I think that's one of the things that I've perhaps tried to put a little bit more emphasis on since I've been running a club. And really, I've also started to realize that the scientific side of things, when I'm trying to write a program to develop like maximal strength, for example, something very straightforward. It's like the athlete they don't need to know that. They don't need a huge amount of detail. I think the interaction I used to have with many of the athletes in the performance program, because I was the sports scientist, all of your language is often so dry and like that's the thing. It doesn't create the best environment. Why do you want to hear about watts and newtons and meters per second when you go to the gym and you just want to lift weights? You know, I think that's one of the things I try to separate away from the club, is use it where it's appropriate or discuss it where it's appropriate. But for the most part, just enjoy training. Like, it's on me to read the articles, digest it, and write a program according to those principles. And if I need to bring some kind of measurement into the process, then I will. And some athletes will prefer to use it, some wouldn't necessarily. But yeah, it's been a big paradigm shift in how I would say I've approached training. I say a bit more of a blend between those two ideas. Real high quality objective data that this is which justifies the training methods that you use, and then the things that just make people want to be there. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to convince them, give them a reason to be there for 10 years. And I think that's it's not a bad place to start. What's going to keep them in the gym for 10 years? And then maybe work back from your program from that. And I think that's, if I could probably summarize my philosophy into something, it's like, start with that, start with, 10 years of training. How do we keep them doing that for 10 years? And then I can worry about the sets and reps and whether we did clusters or complexes and all that other stuff. Because I think that's the stuff that I think that's like the icing on the cake. And I sometimes think it used to be my foundation. And I think that's, I've really almost turned that whole idea on its head. Feel free to criticize that idea as much as you.
No, I relate to that a ton. And I would say that, while I was not involved in a high performance through an NGB, I was at East Tennessee State for 8 years, and the last several years we had scholarships for weightlifting, and we had international and national level lifters, medallists, that, and to go to the sort of the similar situation. This long-term commitment to training, and I think you hit on patience as a coach, but explaining when you come to the gym, you're going to work hard, but then you, the athlete, also need to be patient. I think it was sort of an introduction to me, and I think social media has done a lot of great things for weightlifting, but they're probably a bit more hyper aware now of what others are doing, and so I got to be patient as the coach. I think a lot of the athletes, they need to learn how to work hard, and be committed to it, but at the same time be patient. Those are two kind of conflicting things.
It's interesting though, like that. But then if you put it on the flip side and you say, would you prefer an overly patient athlete or an impatient athlete? I still think I'd probably take the impatient athlete. I'd far rather try and pull them back than push them on. I think trying to pull someone back is probably what you want. I'd far rather someone who's like, can I go heavy today? Can I go heavy today? And me say no and get a little bit irritated, but I like the fact that they want to go heavy, than me having to convince someone or bargain with someone to say, you need another couple of kilos on that bar because it's just too light. And they say, no, I'm still getting the feel of the weight today, or I don't feel up to it today. Like, I still think there's something there. And yes, being patient. And I think most of the conversations I have with many of, particularly my higher performing lifters at the club, is probably conversations that relate to them being more patient. But that's because they're starting here, and I'm trying to pull them back, which is, I think, the reasons why they're good, rather than, right, come on, you need to get moving now. Like, I think, there's a, like you said, there's a balance there. It's an important balance there. And it's not necessarily going to be the same for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you want them to love their sport, and the sport is lifting heavy weights, and so it's probably something they need to have. And I think that I don't know what it's so weightlifting in the U.S. I often explain it's for people that are unfamiliar. I say it's in the Olympic Games and it's not in NCAA, and so therefore there's a whole lot of unique things to that. And so we get a lot of people that are sort of interested in weightlifting, but they're not aware of it's like this is a high level sport in the Olympics, that type of thing. But I guess in the UK, does weightlifting look similar to a whole bunch of other sports with the club structuring system?
I don't know. It's
I mean, I'm sure you're aware, like pretty familiar with the U.S. situation. Do you think it's pretty similar?
I don't know. I think it's always difficult to try and draw parallels between American sport and UK because, like, we have probably three main professional sports in the UK. So football, rugby, and cricket. Probably there may be obviously things like tennis and things like that. But in terms of club-based sports, that's kind of it. Like collegiate system is very different. Like we have something called Bucks, so Bucks British University Championships, and I think weightlifting's only just gained its status as a Bucks sport. But again, it's like, I don't know how, if you could even draw any comparisons between the NCAA and Bucks. The NCAA is probably on par or even in excess of some of our professional sports. I think you guys like professional in football and like American football, I think the attendance can be more than that what we get at our highest level of some professional rugby matches in the UK. So it's I don't know how easy it is to draw similarities in terms of weightlifting. There's probably a lot of similarities in terms of the club systems. It's not professional. Many of the weightlifters will have full-time jobs. I mean, some coaches will try and coach as like their profession. Some people will just do it as a hobby. I think that sounds to be fairly similar to how things are done in the States. I guess one thing I would say, probably deviating slightly, but what is quite noticeable about how much that club system has probably benefited from the presence of CrossFit, and CrossFit has really been it was probably quite heavily criticised when it first came on the scene by weightlifting. I think a few years down the line we should be a bit more grateful to it because it's actually introduced so many people to our sport that would never have even stepped foot in a weightlifting facility. And CrossFit now seems to, many CrossFit clubs or CrossFit boxes in the UK tend to have weightlifting clubs registered within their facility, and it's definitely one of the best feeder activities that we could probably hope for. So credit to CrossFit, because I think, especially in the women's side of things, I think I can attribute a lot of the success that we've seen in recent years to CrossFit.
Personally, without CrossFit, we wouldn't have a gym. Over the years, so we have our weightlifting area for our club is it's in the corner of a CrossFit gym, and not only does it give us a home and a gym, but it we do have people that's how they discover us, either through social media related to the gym, CrossFit gym, or just they're in there and they're sort of looking over what are those people taking breaks doing. To just wrap it up, we're a little over an hour here, Shaun. I can't help you. Thank you enough for doing this.
No, it's a pleasure, mate. It's great to collaborate. Like weightlifting is, as much as increasing in popularity. We don't really have many people close by to actually have these kinds of conversations with as frequently as you would in a strength and conditioning context. So I think that the more there's opportunity to discuss and collaborate and challenge, I think it's really healthy, and I think it benefits the Brit system and the US system. I would hope it would benefit the US system as well, just by having these types of conversations and looking at where there are opportunities to collaborate. And so it's been great, mate. I appreciate the invite.
For sure, yeah, and I very much share your. I really enjoy the sports science role and doing research and the academic stuff, but at the end of the day, the just long-term commitment to the training process and being in the weight room and coaching, there so far is no substitute for me doing that thing, and that's the thing that I'm very confident that's the one thing I want to continue to basically always do.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Okay. Everybody out there watching, we'll be reposting this on the NSCA Facebook page. I'll try to get a YouTube video made of this and put out that link. So thank you everybody for joining, and thanks again.
Thank you.